Underneath a burial mound in China, there may be rivers. Not water rivers. Mercury rivers. A shining, toxic liquid metal poured into channels beneath the earth, flowing through a miniature version of an empire. For centuries, that sounded like mythology. A dead emperor, a hidden palace, a fake sky above him, and rivers of poison below. But modern scientists found something strange in the soil above Qin Shi Huang's unopened tomb. Mercury, not just a trace, unusually high levels, exactly where ancient records said his underground world should be. So the question is no longer just, did China's first emperor really build rivers of mercury? The bigger question is this: what kind of man tries to build an entire empire for himself after death? Over 2,000 years ago, ancient Chinese historians described something that still sounds impossible today. They wrote about the tomb of Qin Shi Huang, the man who unified China and became its first emperor. But they did not describe it as a simple grave, not a coffin, not a stone chamber, not a vault full of treasure. They described it as an underground world. Think about that for a second. An entire world, hidden beneath the earth. According to ancient records, the ceiling of the tomb was designed to represent the heavens. Stars and constellations were mapped above the emperor, like a night sky that would never fade. The floor represented the land of China. Mountains, territories, and the shape of the empire were recreated underground. And running through that buried empire were rivers and seas, but not made of water, made of mercury, liquid metal, beautiful, poisonous, reflective, and deadly. If this were in a fantasy movie, you would probably call it incredible world building. A dead king lying beneath a fake sky, surrounded by rivers of silver poison. But this was not written for Hollywood. It was written as history, and that is what makes the story so strange. Because if the ancient account is even partly true, then Qin Shi Huang did not simply build a tomb. He built a version of China that could follow him into death. And the most frustrating part is this: the main tomb has never been opened. Not once. For more than 2,000 years, the central burial chamber of Qin Shi Huang has remained sealed. The burial mound still exists today in Shaanxi Province, China. From the outside, it looks like a large hill, quiet, green, almost ordinary, but beneath it may be one of the most important unopened archaeological sites on Earth. So why has no one opened it? The answer is not simple. There are serious concerns about preservation. When ancient tombs are opened too quickly, the air, humidity, and light can destroy fragile artifacts almost immediately. Paint can vanish, wood can collapse, organic materials can decay. Something that survived underground for 2,000 years can be ruined in a few minutes if the excavation is done wrong. There are also legal and cultural reasons. Chinese authorities have not approved excavating the central chamber, and honestly, it is not hard to understand why. This is the grave of the emperor who unified China, standardized an empire, and built the foundation of what would become the Great Wall of China. You do not just crack that open like a treasure chest. But here is the important part. Never opened does not mean never studied. And then, in 1974, a group of farmers digging a well accidentally made one of the greatest archaeological discoveries in human history. The Terracotta Army, more than 8,000 life-size clay soldiers, not found by a famous expedition, not found by a team searching for the emperor's lost army, but by local farmers digging a well. Imagine that. For over 2,000 years, thousands of soldiers stood underground in silence. Then one day, someone digging for water accidentally found an army. Each soldier had armor, weapons, ranks, facial details, different hairstyles, different expressions. It was not just a burial decoration. It was a military force made of clay, built to guard an emperor in the afterlife. So when ancient records say there may be something even stranger beneath the main tomb, we should not dismiss it too quickly. Because history has already shown us that this site can hide things on a scale that sounds unbelievable. And that brings us to the Mercury. This is where the story shifts from legend to something harder to ignore. Modern researchers have conducted geochemical surveys around the burial mound. They tested the soil above and around the suspected location of the main tomb chamber. And what they detected was unusual. Mercury concentrations were abnormally high, not randomly scattered. Not just a tiny background trace. The highest mercury readings appeared near the area where researchers believe the central tomb chamber is located. That does not prove there are literal rivers of liquid mercury flowing underground. No one has gone inside and taken a photograph of silver streams running through the darkness. No one has mapped the chamber from the inside. No one knows exactly what is down there, but the mercury signal matters. Because ancient historians specifically wrote that the tomb contained rivers and seas of mercury. And now, above the unopened tomb, modern science has found unusually high mercury levels. That does not give us a final answer, but it does make the ancient account much harder to ignore. And this is where the story becomes more interesting than a simple yes or no question, because the mercury itself may not even be the strangest part. The strangest part is what the mercury was supposed to represent. If the ancient record is right, Qin Shi Huang was not just hiding treasure underground. He was recreating his empire beneath the earth, a sky above him, a map below him, rivers and seas flowing through it, an army guarding him nearby. This was not just a burial. This was a political statement made in stone, clay, and poison. Even in death, the emperor wanted a world. Even underground, he wanted China. And mercury was the perfect material for that dream. Mercury is one of those substances that feels like it should not belong to the ancient world. It looks futuristic. It moves like water. It shines like a mirror. And it kills you quietly. Even today, mercury feels strange. It is a metal, but it flows. It is liquid, but it is heavy. It looks beautiful, but it is toxic. It reflects light, pools in low places, and seems almost alive when it moves. To people in the ancient world, mercury must have felt otherworldly, a substance caught between categories. Not quite solid, not quite water, natural but unnatural, beautiful but dangerous. And for Qin Shi Huang, that mattered. This was an emperor obsessed with power, permanence, and immortality. He wanted to rule forever. He searched for ways to extend his life. He was surrounded by ideas of eternal rule, cosmic order, and life after death. So imagine what mercury would have meant to someone like that. Regular water evaporates. It freezes. It becomes dirty. It disappears. But mercury stays. It does not behave like normal water. It does not rot like wood. It does not fade like paint. It sits there, shining and poisonous, as if it refuses to change. So if Qin Shi Huang wanted rivers that would last forever, mercury made a terrifying kind of sense. An underground map of China. Rivers that never dry up. Seas that never evaporate. A liquid metal empire built for a dead ruler who refused to let death end his authority. That is not random. That is intentional. That is not just decoration. That is a worldview. But this is where we need to be careful, because a lot of history content goes wrong at exactly this point. It takes a real clue and turns it into a fake certainty. It takes an ancient text, a scientific measurement, and a mystery, then pretends the case is already solved. I do not want to do that here. So let's be honest about what we actually know. The tomb is real. The burial mound is real. The terracotta army is real. The ancient written account about mercury rivers is real. The unusually high mercury readings around the tomb are real. But the leap from high mercury levels above a sealed tomb to actual flowing rivers of liquid metal is still a leap. We do not know the exact layout of the chamber. We do not know how much mercury is inside. We do not know whether it was placed in channels, pools, containers, or something else entirely. We do not know if it ever flowed in any meaningful way. And we do not know what has survived after more than 2,000 years underground. That uncertainty may feel unsatisfying. People want the clean answer. Yes, the rivers are real. Or no, the story was just a myth. But the truth is more haunting than that. Because the evidence does not let us completely dismiss the legend, and the sealed tomb does not let us fully confirm it. We are stuck in the space between myth and proof. And sometimes, that is the most fascinating place in history. Because the question is still alive. Somewhere beneath that mound, there may be nothing like the legend. Or there may be a chamber that changes how we understand ancient China forever. There may be collapsed structures. There may be preserved artifacts. There may be traps. There may be painted walls. There may be the remains of a cosmic ceiling, a map of the empire, and traces of mercury where the ancient rivers were supposed to run. Or there may be something no one has even imagined yet. That is the power of an unopened tomb. It keeps the past from becoming fully settled. It keeps one final door closed, and behind that door is not just the body of an emperor. It is the dream of a man who looked at death and tried to build a system around it. Qin Shi Huang did not think small. In life, he unified warring states into an empire. He standardized writing, currency, measurements, and law. He built systems that could outlive any single person. And in death, he seems to have wanted the same thing: order, power, protection, continuity. The Terracotta Army was not only about grief, it was about control. It was an emperor saying, even underground, I will not be alone. Even in death, I will be guarded. Even after my body is gone, my command will remain. And if the Mercury rivers are real, even partially, they tell us something even more extreme. They suggest he did not want a grave. He wanted a universe, a private empire beneath the earth, complete with soldiers, complete with rivers, complete with a mapped sky, complete with the illusion that his rule could continue forever. That is why this story is so powerful. Not because Mercury is strange, though it is. Not because the tomb is unopened, though that is incredible. But because the whole thing reveals something deeply human and deeply terrifying. The fear of death, the hunger for control, the fantasy that power can cross the boundary between life and whatever comes after it. Most people build monuments because they want to be remembered. Qin Shi Huang may have built an underground empire because he wanted to continue. And somewhere beneath a quiet hill in China, that sealed world may still be waiting. Not just a tomb, not just a myth, but a buried version of an empire. Toxic, brilliant, silent, and still beyond our reach. So did Qin Shi Huang really build rivers of Mercury underground? We do not know. Not yet. But the evidence makes it impossible to completely rule out. And maybe that is the most haunting answer of all. Because after more than 2,000 years, the emperor's final secret is still doing exactly what it was meant to do. It is still sealed. It is still protected. And we are still standing outside, wondering what kind of world he left beneath the earth. Should the tomb ever be opened? Or should some doors in history stay closed forever? I'll let you sit with that question for a second. Drop your answer below. Should we open the emperor's tomb or leave his sealed world untouched? I read all of them. And if you want more stories where ancient history and modern science collide, subscribe. This is the kind of mystery we dig into here. Some people believe China's Terracotta Warriors were built around real human bodies, real soldiers, sealed in clay, buried to guard an emperor forever. It sounds absurd, but when you stand in front of them, the rumor suddenly feels less impossible. They do not feel like statues. They feel like people who stopped moving a moment ago. The set of a jaw, the tension in a brow, the weight in a soldier's shoulders. And that raises a more interesting question than whether the rumor is true. Not just, were real people buried inside these figures? But why does that idea feel so strangely believable? Because the answer to that question is far more impressive than the myth itself. Since their discovery in 1974, one disturbing rumor has refused to die. That the Terracotta Warriors were not merely modeled after real men, that they were real men, trapped inside clay and buried to serve Qin Shi Huang in death. The reason this story spread so easily is not hard to understand. First, there are the faces. The warriors near Xi'an feel astonishingly individual. Even when certain facial types repeat, the details shift. The expression, the hairstyle, the beard, the depth of a wrinkle, the shape of a mouth. The overall effect is not of copies, but of a crowd. For most of history, people had no framework for how ancient craftsmen could create that kind of realism on such a massive scale. So they reached for the most emotionally satisfying explanation. They must have used real people. The second reason is the emperor himself. Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor to unify China, was remembered by later historians as ruthless, paranoid, and obsessed with control. That reputation made the rumor easy to believe. If people already imagine a ruler as capable of anything, then a story like this barely feels like a leap at all. And in recent years, the rumor found a new life online. Videos and posts repeated claims about disturbing expressions, hidden bones, and soldiers burned alive inside the statues, often presenting speculation as if it were established fact. But archaeology tells a very different story. First, the internal evidence does not support the myth. Archaeologists have not found human bones, organic remains, or biological traces inside the Terracotta Warriors, and that matters more than it might sound. A kiln does not make a human body vanish without evidence. Under extreme heat, organic material changes. Bone chars and calcifies. Hair carbonizes. Biological material leaves traces. After decades of excavation and study, that signature is absent. At kiln temperatures, the idea of an intact human body existing inside these figures without leaving evidence is simply not credible. Second, the manufacturing process makes the theory collapse. Most people imagine a statue as something sculpted whole, all at once. The Terracotta Warriors were not made that way. They were created through a highly organized workshop process. Different parts of the figure were shaped or molded separately, joined together with clay, refined by hand, fired, and then painted. That method is fundamentally incompatible with the idea of a living person being sealed inside. These are ceramic figures built by craft, not bodies hidden inside shells. Third, the craftsmen left their own traces behind, and this may be the most revealing detail of all. Archaeologists found fingerprints baked into the clay. Marks left accidentally by workers during the shaping process, preserved for more than 2,000 years. They also found workshop marks and names linked to production, evidence of an organized labor system with structure, supervision, and accountability. These are not traces of victims. They are traces of craftsmen. And this is where the story stops being about a debunked myth and becomes something genuinely astonishing. The sculptors likely worked from real-world observation. They studied soldiers, postures, armor, facial types, and military rank, then translated those observations into clay through a system designed to create variation. Status and role were suggested through hairstyle, armor, and facial treatment. Subtle shifts in the jaw, brow, mouth, and stance gave the figures a powerful sense of presence, or at least the illusion of it. The result was not 8,000 literal portraits in the modern sense. It was something more sophisticated, a workshop system designed to produce the feeling of individuality on a massive scale. And that is what the rumor has always obscured. The story survived not because it was true, but because the warriors looked too human for many people to accept that craftsmanship alone, however extraordinary, could explain them. In that sense, the myth is almost a strange compliment to the people who made them. The warriors do not look this way because real men died inside them. They look this way because the people who built them were that good. Qin Shi Huang seems to have imagined the afterlife as a continuation of earthly rule. In that vision, an army was not merely decorative. It was meant to continue serving him in death. That helps explain why the warriors were arranged in military formation, equipped with real weapons, and built as part of a much larger funerary complex. He did not create an army of clay simply to leave behind a monument. He created it because he intended his power to outlast his life. Archaeology settled the question of hidden human bodies a long time ago, but the more interesting thing, the thing actually worth sitting with, is what the real story says about the people who built this. Thousands of craftsmen, working without modern machinery, created something that still unsettles people more than 2,000 years later. Some of them pressed their fingers into wet clay and moved on. Those fingerprints are still there. That is not a horror story. It is something stranger. A civilization so technically capable that later generations found it easier to believe in buried victims than in the full power of human skill. 4,000 years ago, an ordinary family in northwestern China prepared a bowl of noodles. They probably assumed that the next day would arrive just like any other. But that meal was never finished. Thousands of years later, archaeologists excavating a buried house discovered a pottery bowl lying upside down on the floor. When they carefully lifted it, they found something underneath that should have disappeared long ago. A tangled mass of thin, fragile strands. They were the remains of noodles buried for roughly 4,000 years. But the bowl was not the most disturbing discovery inside this village. In nearby homes, archaeologists found the people who never escaped. Adults and children lay inside the rooms. Some had been pressed against the walls. Others were clustered closely together. The houses were damaged. The ground was split by cracks. And thick layers of mud had buried nearly everything. This place is known as Lajia. It has sometimes been called China's Pompeii. But Pompeii was destroyed by a volcano. At Lajia, the identity of the killer is still debated. Was it an earthquake? A sudden flood? A wall of mud? Or a chain of disasters that struck one after another? Today, we're going to reconstruct the final hours of Lajia. And our first clue is a bowl of noodles that no one ever finished. Lajia lies along the upper reaches of the Yellow River in what is now China's Qinghai province. The settlement existed roughly 4,000 years ago, more than 1,000 years before the first emperor united China. There was no Chinese empire yet, no Great Wall, none of the famous dynasties that most people associate with ancient China. The people who lived here belonged to what archaeologists call the Qijia culture. Lajia was not an imperial capital or a giant ceremonial center. It was closer to a prehistoric village made up of ordinary households. Its people grew millet, raised animals, cooked meals, and made tools inside partly sunken homes. They left behind no written records and no personal names. But their houses, pottery, food, and everyday objects show that this was once a stable, living community. Then, on one terrible day, normal life suddenly stopped. Food was left behind. Pottery remained inside the houses. And some residents never made it out of their rooms. Whatever happened, it happened fast. In 2005, a study published in the journal Nature brought worldwide attention to Lajia. Researchers examined the fragile strands found beneath the overturned bowl and identified them as the oldest physical evidence of noodles then known. They were thin and yellowish, trapped beneath the bowl and covered by thick layers of sediment. That unusual burial environment may be the reason they survived at all. Under normal conditions, food this delicate would have decomposed thousands of years ago. But these were not ordinary wheat noodles like the ones most of us eat today. Early research suggested that they were made mainly from millet hardy grains that once formed a major part of the diet in northern China. Millet does not contain the kind of gluten that makes wheat dough stretchy, so exactly how ancient cooks turned it into long, thin strands remains an interesting subject of experimentation and debate. The discovery matters for more than just its age. It shows that ordinary people in prehistoric China had already developed surprisingly sophisticated ways of processing grain. But the position of the bowl raises another question. Why was it upside down? Did it fall when the house collapsed? Or did something powerful rush into the room and flip it over? The answer may be connected to the people found inside the other houses. Archaeologists discovered groups of human remains inside several homes at Lajia. They included both adults and children. These were not carefully arranged burials. The people had died inside their living spaces. Some were found near walls. Some lay close together. In certain cases, an adult appeared to be positioned between danger and a smaller child. We have to be careful here. A final position cannot prove exactly how two people were related, or tell us with certainty what someone was doing during their last moments. But these remains do reveal something important. The disaster gave them almost no time to escape. If the village had faced only a slowly rising flood, people should have had some opportunity to leave their low, partly sunken homes and reach higher ground. Instead, they were trapped inside. That suggests the first blow may not have come from the river. It may have come from beneath their feet. Lajia sits in a geologically active region. Investigations of the site have found deformed floors, damaged buildings, and intersecting cracks in the ground. That makes an earthquake our first suspect. Imagine the scene. The ground begins to shake without warning. The walls of the sunken houses split. Roof supports fail. Pottery crashes to the floor. Soil and debris block the exits. Anyone inside may have had only seconds to react. An earthquake could explain the damaged homes, the cracked ground, and why some residents were unable to escape. But it cannot explain everything. Lajia was not simply a village crushed by shaking. Large amounts of sediment entered the houses, filled the cracks, and buried people, pottery, and household objects. If the earthquake was only the first blow, where did the second one come from? The landscape around Lajia contains gullies and large amounts of loose, easily eroded sediment. During intense rain, Water can race through those gullies, collecting soil and debris as it moves toward lower ground. This would not necessarily look like a giant Hollywood tsunami. The real danger may have been something heavier, thicker, and far more difficult to escape. A fast-moving wall of mud. Once mud entered a sunken house, it could quickly block the exit, pin down objects, and fill the very space where people had taken shelter. For buildings already damaged by an earthquake, the consequences would have been devastating. Several studies have therefore argued that flash floods and mud flows from nearby gullies better explain at least some of the sediment covering Lajia than a single, enormous flood coming directly from the Yellow River. But the earthquake and the mud flow may not be competing explanations. They may have been separate stages of the same disaster. And 4,000 years later, another earthquake in almost the same region showed how that could happen. In December 2023, a magnitude 6.2 earthquake struck the Jishishan region, only a short distance from Lajia. The danger did not end when the shaking stopped. In some areas, the earthquake was followed by soil liquefaction, ground failure, landslides, and high-speed mud flows. Mud and debris traveled along channels and poured into villages, burying homes. During the rescue operation, 3 adults were reportedly found protecting 2 children who had been wrapped in a quilt. A 2024 study compared that modern scene with the positions of adults and children discovered at Lajia. The researchers argued that the similarity could reflect the same human instinct. Adults gathering around children as mud suddenly entered a home. That comparison does not prove the identities of the people at Lajia, and by itself, it cannot solve the entire case. But the modern earthquake provides a disturbing real-world model for what may have happened 4,000 years earlier. First, an earthquake damages the ground and the buildings. Then the soil liquefies or begins to slide. Mud and debris race through nearby gullies and enter structures that are already weakened. A 2026 study published in the journal Katna also connected the earthquake cracks at Lajia with the flash flood and mudflow deposits covering the settlement. A possible sequence begins to emerge. A powerful earthquake strikes the village. Homes are damaged, residents become trapped, cracks open across the ground. Then intense rain, flash flooding, or mud flows move into the settlement, filling those cracks and pouring into the sunken houses. The people of Lajia may have lost their shelter first and their escape routes moments later. That could explain why so many never made it outside. But the case is still not completely closed. Because another, more dramatic theory once connected Lajia to one of China's oldest legends. Ancient China had its own story of a great flood. According to the legend, a hero known as Yu the Great eventually brought the waters under control. His story later became connected with the Xia, traditionally described as China's earliest dynasty. In 2016, researchers proposed that an earthquake around 1920 BC triggered a massive landslide in the upper Yellow River. The landslide blocked the river and created a temporary lake. When that natural dam finally failed, an enormous volume of water may have rushed downstream. The researchers suggested that this event could have inspired China's great flood story. It was a compelling chain of evidence. An earthquake, a collapsed natural dam, a prehistoric settlement, a catastrophic flood, and an ancient legend about the birth of a dynasty. The pieces seem to fit almost perfectly, maybe too perfectly. Later studies challenged the timeline. The natural dam, the deaths at Lajia, the earthquake evidence, and the different flood deposits may not all belong to the same event. That means the Yellow River flood may not have directly destroyed Lajia, and Lajia alone cannot prove that the story of Yu the Great or the founding of the Xia dynasty happened exactly as later traditions described. This is one of archaeology's most dangerous temptations. When a discovery is dramatic enough, we want it to confirm an even greater story. But events occurring in roughly the same period are not automatically connected. And sometimes, the most exciting answer is not the one best supported by the evidence. We may never know the exact second when the disaster at Lajia began. Did the earthquake strike first? How long did it take for the mud to reach the village? Did the residents face one catastrophe or several events in rapid succession? And when, exactly, did that bowl fall upside down? Some of those questions remain unanswered, but the noodles matter for more than their place in the history of food. Emperors leave behind tombs. Dynasties leave palaces. Wars leave weapons and city walls. Ordinary people rarely leave their voices behind. The people of Lajia left no names and no written accounts. They left their homes, their pottery, their tools, and a meal that was never finished. 4,000 years ago, someone prepared that food. They assumed that life would continue as it always had. Then the ground began to move. The houses cracked. Mud poured into the village. And within a very short time, their world stopped. We may never identify the first force that struck Lajia, but that overturned bowl preserves something more personal than the rise and fall of any dynasty. 4,000 years ago, someone prepared a meal. They believed they still had time to eat it. They didn't. The noodles survived. Many of the people of Lajia did not. If you want to discover more Chinese historical mysteries that most American viewers have never heard of, subscribe to the channel. Because beneath the soil of China, many cases are still waiting to be solved. Bulging eyes, giant ears, an exaggerated mouth. Was this really made by people in ancient China? Many people call it the alien mask. But today, we are not going to tell an alien story. Actually, the opposite is true. If you only see Sanxingdui as an alien mystery, you may miss something even more shocking. More than 3,000 years ago, in the Sichuan Basin of southwestern China, there was a highly developed bronze civilization, strange, powerful, and almost completely unknown to most people outside China. This was not the China most Americans imagine. Not the Great Wall, not emperors in palaces, not the Terracotta Army, not the familiar image of dragons, dynasties, and imperial courts. Sanxingdui left behind something very different. Bronze masks, gold face coverings, a massive bronze sacred tree, ivory, jade, and thousands of mysterious objects that were broken, burned, and buried underground. So here's the first question. If these objects were so valuable, why would the people of Sanxingdui destroy them? The answer may be more complicated than treasure. Many artifacts found at Sanxingdui were not placed neatly inside tombs like ordinary burial goods. Some were smashed, some were burned, some were buried together in large pits. That does not look like storage. It does not look like a normal funeral. It looks more like the remains of a huge ritual after it was over. In other words, they may not have been throwing these objects away. They may have been sending them into another world. This is a logic we see in many ancient civilizations. The more precious something is, the more likely it may be offered to gods, ancestors, or supernatural forces. To us, destroying a treasure feels irrational. But to them, destruction may have been the point. A sacred object was not always meant to survive for human eyes. Sometimes it had to be broken, burned, and buried in order to complete its journey. So the strangest thing about Sanxingdui is not simply that they had treasure. It is that they were willing to destroy their treasure with their own hands. But that leads to the next question. If this was a ritual, why did the faces used in these rituals look so inhuman? When you look at a Sanxingdui bronze mask, the first thing you notice is the eyes. They are not normal eyes. They bulge outward, as if they are pushing out from the face. The ears are huge. The mouth is wide. The proportions of the entire face feel almost impossible. If you think this is supposed to be a portrait, then yes, it looks bizarre. But maybe that is the wrong way to look at it. Maybe this face was never meant to copy a human being. Maybe it was meant to go beyond human beings. In a ritual world, a god cannot look too ordinary. An ancestor cannot be just an old man. Power cannot be represented by a plain human face. It has to be enlarged, distorted, made sacred. It has to make the person standing before it feel fear and awe. So when these masks look alien to us, that may be a modern misunderstanding. We are used to explaining strange ancient art through the images we already know from science fiction. Big eyes, strange faces, non-human shapes. So our brain immediately says, alien. But to the people of Sanxingdui, this may not have been the face of an alien. It may have been the face of a god, the face of an ancestor, the face of a being higher than ordinary humans. And that means the most alien-looking part of Sanxingdui may actually be the most human part, because humans have always done this. We use art to create mystery. We use ritual to create authority. We use exaggerated images to explain a world we cannot fully control. But if these masks represented gods or ancestors, then the next question becomes even bigger. Where did these gods live? Sanxingdui may have left us an answer hidden inside a bronze tree. The bronze sacred tree is one of the most unbelievable objects ever found at Sanxingdui. It is not just decoration. Its trunk rises upward. Its branches spread outward. There are birds on the branches. There are flowers. There are mysterious creatures. From our modern point of view, we might simply say, it is a tree. But to the people who made it, it may have been much more than that. It may have been a map of the universe. It may have connected the earth, the sky, and the world of spirits. It may have represented the movement of the sun. It may have symbolized ancestors, divine birds, or a path between humans and heaven. We cannot say with certainty what every detail meant, but we can say one thing clearly. This was not made just to look beautiful. It was made to turn the universe into something visible, a cosmos cast in bronze. And this is where the story of Sanxingdui changes. It is no longer just a story about strange artifacts. It becomes the story of a complete civilization. Because Sanxingdui did not only have masks, it did not only have gold, it did not only have advanced bronze technology, it had its own spiritual world. The masks show us how they imagined the divine. The bronze tree shows us how they imagined the universe. The ritual pits show us how they tried to communicate with that universe. And that is why Sanxingdui matters so much. Not because it looks strange, but because it proves that ancient China was never just one simple story. When many people think of ancient Chinese civilization, they think of the Yellow River, the Central Plains, the Shang and Zhou dynasties, and later the Qin and Han empires. That picture is not wrong, but it is incomplete. Sanxingdui reminds us that more than 3,000 years ago, far upstream along the Yangtze River, in what is now the Sichuan Basin, there was another complex center of civilization. It was technically advanced, artistically unique, and spiritually powerful. It was not outside Chinese history. It was a lost part of Chinese history, pulled back out of the ground. For American viewers, this is especially important, because the image of ancient China is often very narrow. Emperors, dragons, the Great Wall, palaces, and the Terracotta Warriors. But Sanxingdui suddenly shows us another face of ancient China, a face that is unfamiliar, mysterious, and even a little unsettling. So now comes the next question. If this civilization was so advanced, why does it seem to have disappeared? That is the real cold case of Sanxingdui. Sanxingdui did not leave behind enough clear written records to tell us exactly who they were. We do not know what they called themselves. We do not know exactly why they made these masks. We do not know exactly why they smashed, burned, and buried these objects. We are left with ruins, artifacts, materials, craftsmanship, and cultural traces that may connect to later traditions in the Sichuan region. Maybe the civilization declined. Maybe its people migrated. Maybe its traditions were absorbed by later cultures. Maybe it did not vanish suddenly at all. Maybe it simply continued in another form. But for us today, Sanxingdui feels like a silent witness. It left behind enough evidence to shock us, but not enough explanation to comfort us. And that is exactly why the alien theory became so popular. When modern people see something they cannot easily explain, the simplest answer is often this: aliens. Why are the masks so strange? Aliens. Why is the bronze tree so complex? Aliens. Why does this civilization look so different from the version of ancient China we already know? Aliens again. But that answer is too easy. It hides the real mystery. Because the truly shocking possibility is not that aliens visited ancient China. The truly shocking possibility is that ancient people were fully capable of creating something this strange, this grand, and this spiritually complex all by themselves. They were not primitive people stumbling in darkness, waiting for modern civilization to explain the world to them. They looked up at the sky. They worshipped gods. They organized rituals. They cast enormous bronze objects. They tried to understand death, power, nature, and the universe in their own way. Their answers were simply not the answers we are used to. So the next time you see a Sanxingdui mask, do not rush to ask, was this made by aliens? Ask a more interesting question. More than 3,000 years ago, what kind of people stood between fire, earth, and bronze and created a face like this? Why did they need gods that looked this way? What were they afraid of? What did they believe? Maybe Sanxingdui looks like it came from another world, not because it was truly alien to Earth. Maybe it looks that way because we have forgotten how strange human civilization can be. Sanxingdui is not just a bizarre legend. It is not a footnote in Chinese history. It is a missing piece of the puzzle, dug out of the ground after thousands of years. It reminds us that ancient China was never a single story. There were the dynasties of the Yellow River, and there was the mysterious bronze world of the Sichuan Basin. There was history written in texts, and there was history buried silently in the soil. And Sanxingdui stands in that silence, staring back at us with its bulging bronze eyes from more than 3,000 years ago, almost as if it is asking, do you really understand the past? Or do you only understand the parts of it that happened to survive? 4,500 years ago, long before China had an emperor, the Great Wall, or even a unified kingdom, a massive city rose in what is now northern China. Above ground, it had walls, gates, ditches, and layer after layer of defense. But that was not enough. Beneath all of it, its builders carved out a hidden network of underground passages, a system that could save the people inside the walls or destroy them. Over the next few minutes, we're going to reconstruct how this fortress worked, what archaeologists have found beneath it, and why these tunnels reveal something far bigger than a clever military trick. They reveal a society more organized and more afraid than we'd expect from this period of history. The site is called Houchengzui. It sits in today's Inner Mongolia, on the banks of the Hun River. The settlement dates back roughly 4,200 to 4,500 years, the late Neolithic period. That matters. This was long before the Qin dynasty, the Han dynasty, or any imperial capital. You might picture a farming village, a cluster of homes, some storage pits, maybe a simple wall. Instead, archaeologists uncovered a planned settlement covering about 1.38 million square meters, roughly 340 acres. This was a real city, with residential areas, burial zones, and a defense system built on a citywide scale. So why did a community this early need defenses this elaborate? Imagine approaching Houchengzui as an attacker. You don't just hit one wall and walk through. You face layer after layer, outer ditches, defensive platforms, watchtower-like projections aimed at anyone approaching, and gates built to force people through narrow, controlled paths. Archaeologists have identified two nested barbican enclosures wrapped around the main gate defensive rings within rings. It was a funnel. The deeper an attacker moved in, the less freedom they had compressed into smaller spaces, exposed from multiple sides, with another line of defense always waiting behind the first. For a city built more than 4,000 years ago, this was remarkably deliberate engineering, and all of that was just above ground. Buried beneath the outer defensive rings, archaeologists found something stranger: underground passages, cutting through the earth at depths of several feet, some with arched ceilings, running in different directions rather than toward one central point. At least one appears to connect the inner and outer barbican areas, linking two separate rings of defense underground. That detail changes everything. This wasn't one emergency hole dug in a panic. It was a system built into the design from the start. And once you see it that way, the mystery gets harder, not easier. A city with this many walls already had serious protection. So why dig even deeper? The most obvious answer is war. These tunnels may have let defenders move without being seen, carrying supplies, reaching key positions, or slipping between sections of the fortifications during a siege. But there's a catch archaeologists keep coming back to. A hidden passage only protects a city while it stays hidden. The moment an enemy finds the entrance, the advantage flips. A route built to move defenders out becomes a route for attackers to move in. A supply line becomes a weakness. That risk means these tunnels weren't dug casually. Their placement had to be planned as carefully as the walls above them. There's also a quieter possibility. These passages may have simply been part of daily life inside the city routes for moving people or materials between defensive zones during ordinary times, and only becoming a military asset when a crisis hit. The same tunnel, two completely different jobs, depending on what was happening above ground. But the real surprise at Houchengzui isn't that people 4,500 years ago knew how to dig tunnels. It's the coordination this city required. Walls, gates, ditches, platforms, and underground passages all had to work together. Builders needed to know exactly where the walls would stand before they dug beneath them. Crews had to remove enormous amounts of soil, brace the ceilings, and keep the whole thing from collapsing while keeping it connected to a defensive plan happening on the surface at the same time. That takes more than one household's effort. It takes a citywide decision, someone with the authority to decide where the city would grow, what got protected, and how much labor the community would pour into defense before a threat ever arrived. The rest of the site backs this up. Archaeologists found residential areas, burial grounds, and buildings that stood apart from ordinary homes. Jade objects were placed within the stone walls themselves, a detail that suggests the defenses carried symbolic weight, not just practical value. This wasn't only a fortress. It was a living city, connected culturally to other major sites of the same era, including the massive stone city of Shimao far to the south. Ideas, materials, and building techniques were moving across long distances, which tells us Houchengzui wasn't isolated. But contact isn't the same as peace. So who were they afraid of? That's the question the tunnels can't answer. No evidence gives us the name or face of an enemy. We don't know if Houchengzui ever survived an actual siege or whether these passages were ever used in one. What we have is a city that prepared as if the danger were real, layered walls, controlled gates, and a hidden world running underneath all of it. Archaeology rarely hands us a complete story. It hands us pieces. At Houchengzui, those pieces show a community that understood space, risk, and defense well enough to build the ground above and the ground below as one connected system. 4,500 years later, much of that system is still buried. And the next discovery here may not just tell us what the tunnels were for. It may tell us exactly what kind of world made people build them in the first place. Imagine becoming the only woman in Chinese history to rule as emperor. Not queen, not empress consort. Emperor. You survive the palace. You defeat rival families. You outlast ministers, princes, generals, and even your own children. You build a dynasty around your name. And then, when you die, you leave behind a stone monument almost 25 feet tall, weighing nearly 100 tons. Completely blank. No name, no achievements, no confession, no apology. For more than 1,300 years, people have stood before that empty stone and asked one question. Why would a woman who fought so hard to be remembered choose to leave no words at all? This is the story of Wu Zetian, China's only female emperor, and the blank stone that may be her greatest message. Wu Zetian was born into a world where power had a gender. Men inherited it, men explained it, men wrote it down. Women could stand near power. They could influence it. They could give birth to it, but they were not supposed to become it. At around 14, Wu entered the imperial palace as a low-ranking concubine. The palace was a beautiful machine built to consume people. One glance could change your life. One rumor could end it. Most women who entered that world disappeared into its walls. Wu did not. When Emperor Taizong died, custom said her story should be over. Like many of his concubines, she was sent away to become a Buddhist nun. A quiet ending. A woman erased. But Wu Zetian came back. She returned to the palace under the next emperor, Gaozong, the son of the man she had once served. That alone was scandalous. But the scandal was only the door. Wu became Gaozong's favorite, then empress. Then, as the emperor grew weaker, the real power behind the throne. Because Wu Zetian did not just want influence. Influence still depends on someone else's permission. Wu wanted authority. The records around her rise are dark and complicated. Her enemies said she framed rivals, destroyed families, and used fear as a political weapon. One infamous story claims that her infant daughter died mysteriously in the palace, and that Wu used the death to accuse Empress Wang, her rival. Was that true? Or was it written later by men who could not accept a woman on the throne? That is the problem with Wu Zetian. Every story about her has a shadow behind it. The history books were written by people from a world she had humiliated. To them, she was not just ambitious. She was unnatural, and yet, she was also effective. She promoted talented officials, strengthened the examination system, and used religion, ceremony, informants, and political theater with terrifying skill. She understood something simple and brutal. Power is not taken once. It has to be performed every day. Then, in the year 690, Wu Zetian did the unthinkable. She declared herself emperor. Not empress, emperor. She created her own Zhou dynasty and placed herself at the center of the empire. A woman had entered a system designed to erase her and force that system to speak her name. So when she died, you would expect her monument to be loud, proud, and full of praise. That is what emperors did. They turned stone into propaganda. But at Qianling Mausoleum, where Wu Zetian was buried beside Emperor Gaozong, her great stone stele was left blank, and the silence feels deliberate. So why? The first theory is that no words were big enough. How do you summarize a girl who entered the palace as a concubine and ended as emperor of China? Maybe the blank stone was not humility. Maybe it was arrogance so large it needed no sentence. It was saying, "The empire is my inscription." The second theory is that she wanted history to judge her. Wu knew officials after her death would debate her, condemn her, and force her back into a shape they understood. So perhaps she refused to write her own verdict. She left the case open, not guilty, not innocent, unfinished. A written inscription gives you an answer. A blank one traps you inside the question. The third theory is darker. Maybe Wu knew that any words she left would be used against her. If she praised herself, they would call her arrogant. If she defended herself, they would call her guilty. If she apologized, they would say it was not enough. If she explained, they would rewrite the explanation. So she gave them nothing. No sentence to attack. No confession to twist. Every emperor used stone to speak. Wu Zetian used stone to refuse. But the most interesting theory is this. The silence was not empty. It was a trap. A blank stone makes every generation expose itself. If you fear female power, you see a monster. If you admire rebellion, you see a pioneer. If you study government, you see a brilliant ruler. If you study cruelty, you see a warning. Wu Zetian left no words and somehow forced everyone else to keep talking. Over the centuries, visitors, scholars, and later generations carved poems and inscriptions onto it. Wu left it blank. Humanity could not resist writing on it. Almost like she knew we would. Almost like the monument was never meant to tell us who she was. It was meant to reveal who we are when we try to judge her. That is why Wu Zetian is still so unsettling. She does not fit cleanly into one sentence. She was not simply a monster. She was not simply a hero. She was brilliant. She was ruthless. Necessary to some, terrifying to others. And when eternity asked her for an explanation, she gave it silence, no defense. No apology, no final speech, just a blank stone standing in front of history. For more than 1,300 years, people have tried to decide what Wu Zetian really was. And the stone keeps giving the same answer, nothing, which somehow says everything. So here is the question. If you could carve one sentence onto Wu Zetian's blank stone, what would you write? Because after 1,300 years, we are still doing exactly what she may have wanted. We are still trying to finish her story.